G'day everyone, my name's Pike and I'm here to talk about the papacy in the Bible. So the first place we turn to is Isaiah chapter 22, and we go to verse 15 to verse 25. And what we read in this chapter is that the kings of Israel had what was called a chief steward, or someone over the house. We read in this example where God makes a man called Eliakim the new steward of King Hezekiah, and he is a replacement to a past steward known as Shebna. So we read in verse 21, "And I will clothe him, Eliakim, with thy, Shebna's, robe, and will strengthen him with thy girdle, and will give thy power into his hand, and he shall be as a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to the house of Judah. And I will lay the key of the house of David upon his shoulder, and he shall shut, and none shall open, and he shall open, and none shall shut." And so what we see in this chapter is that the steward, or the one who is over the house, you see that title applied in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 6 to Ahishar, the steward of King Solomon. So we see that this man was like a second in command to the king, the second most powerful in the kingdom of David. Now, Jesus Christ is the new king of the new kingdom of Israel, and we find this if we go to the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 1 verse 49. And what we find in this chapter is very special, because in this chapter Nathanael says that Jesus Christ is, and he calls him this, the King of Israel. And so we understand that the disciples of Jesus saw him as the King of Israel. Now, this is important because we have seen that the kings of Israel in the Old Testament all traditionally had chief stewards, according to Isaiah chapter 22, 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 6, and many other verses. So Jesus, as the new king of Israel, hello little pretty buddy, Jesus as the new king is traditionally expected to appoint a chief steward. And so that is immediately grounds for the papacy, because the papacy is the idea that King Jesus appointed a line of stewards who would serve him in governing the people as the stewards of old did. So we see that this tradition of someone serving the king and helping to govern the people and his believers is rooted in the Old Testament tradition of the kings of Israel having the chief steward, or the one over the house. But we get confirmation that Jesus does this, that he in fact does reinstate this tradition in St. Peter. If we turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 21, we read in verses 15 to 17, "When therefore they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?'" He's saying, do you love me more than the other disciples? And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." That means the other disciples that are there with him. And 2 more times, Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, of course, I love you." But Jesus asks him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" And Peter is hurt by this. And he says, "Of course, you know everything. You know that I love you." And so Jesus, a 3rd time, says, "Feed my sheep." So each time Peter says, "Yes, of course, I love you," Jesus replies, "Feed my sheep." So he's given to Peter this task to take care of the flock of believers, the other disciples at the time, but also believers in the future. So we see that Peter is given this special role. Peter. And my cat's name is Peter, by the way. But so we see that Peter is given this special role of being the second place to Jesus. He has charge over feeding the flock of the believers of Jesus, just as the stewards of the kings in the Old Testament had charge over administering and serving the people and governing them in service to the king. And so we see that Jesus reinstates this position in Peter. But we can go to many other verses which show that Jesus gave this important role to St. Peter, such as Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 to 19, where Jesus makes Peter the rock upon which his church is built, and other verses such as verse 19, where he says, I give to thee the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But not just that, chapter 22 of Luke, where he says to Peter, strengthen thy brethren, which is another very amazing chapter. And so, but we can also hear from St. Peter himself if we go to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, verse 7. And when there had been much disputing among all the disciples and the elders that had gathered at Jerusalem, Peter, rising up, said to them, Men, brethren, you know that God made a choice among us, that by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the word of the gospel and believe. Now, Peter obviously knows that God gave all the disciples and all his believers the task of preaching the gospel by their mouth. Peter knows that he's not the only one who was given this task. So why does he say that God chose from among us, the other disciples there, that by my mouth the gospel should be preached, if he knows everyone else was also given that task? So it's evident to me that Peter acknowledges that he has been given a distinct role among all the other preachers of the gospel in order for him to so directly state among the other preachers that he was chosen to preach the gospel. And so I think it's fairly obvious and clear. This is how it goes. The kings of Israel had chief stewards. Isaiah 22, verse 15 to 25. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 6, where Ahashar is shown to be over the house. It's the official ancient title for the chief steward. The kings of Israel had chief stewards. That's the first point. Jesus is the new king of Israel. John chapter 1, verse 49. John chapter 19, verse 19, I believe, and many other chapters. Revelation has tons of verses where he's called the King of Kings before he returns to earth, chronologically in Revelation. So the kings of Israel had chief stewards. Jesus is the new king of Israel. Therefore, traditionally, he is expected to appoint a chief steward. So that's a biblical route to the papacy. And then we see that Jesus does instate this traditional role of the chief steward again by making Peter his second man with authority to feed the other sheep, the disciples and other believers, the rock upon which his church is built, the strengthener of his brethren, and the one who was chosen by his mouth to preach the gospel. And so, and the second to an Israelite king is automatically the chief steward. That's how that works. If you become the second man to an Israelite king, by default, by the nature of that role, you are the chief steward traditionally. And Jesus knew when he made Peter his second man that the role traditionally of the second man to the king was this chief steward role. And Jesus knew that that role included succession of office, so that when Peter dies, he would be succeeded. And we see that so clearly in Isaiah chapter 22, when Eliakim succeeds Shebna, verse 15 to 25. And so Jesus knows this and instates Peter into this role, knowing it will be succeeded according to the tradition of that role. Going back to the Old Testament, Jesus knows that tradition. He doesn't refute it. when he makes Peter take this position. Thank you very much